Ho, 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 ho. Merry Christmas. It's me, Santa Claus. I'm back to read another chapter in our book, A Miracle on 34th Street. Now, this book has 18 chapters, and today we're reading chapter 9. So we're already halfway through. It's going quite well, just zooming right along to chapter 9. So let's see what they're up to. Kringle was playing Matchmaker yesterday, as you remember, with Fred and Susan. Nope, Fred and Doris. Susan is a little girl. So let's go ahead and dive right into chapter 9 and see what's going to happen next. Are you excited? I'm a little excited. So, all right. Fred boldly entered the imposing portals of Tiffany & Company the following afternoon. He wanted to buy a brooch, he told the elderly, dignified clerk, who condescended to wait on him, but he wanted a certain kind. He tried to describe the one Doris had lost without much success. The clerk showed him several very handsome brooches, but none of them seemed to be what Fred was looking for. The clerk finally thought he knew what Fred had in mind. Unfortunately, he had nothing like that at the moment. "Why don't you try Cartier's?" he suggested. "It's only a few blocks away. They have some lovely things." Fred stared at the clerk in amazement. "Cartier's sent me here," he said. "Oh, yes," remarked the clerk. "Cartier's have sent us a number of customers lately." Fred left the store, still lost in wonder. He had seen the advertisements and news stories heralding the wave of goodwill which Chris had started, but he realized now for the first time how widespread it had become. If Tiffany's were sending people to Cartier's, anything could happen. We get a picture right away. There in front of a Christmas tree stood Mr. Macy and Mr. Gimble actually shaking hands. And there's Chris in the middle, and they're shaking hands. Back in the olden days, big department stores had what they called rivalries, where one's trying to be better than the others. So to have two big stores in a big city like New York City have two big giants of department stores shaking hands was a big deal. So not so much now, but back then it was pretty much a big deal. Let's go ahead and finish this chapter, shall we? All right. Fred finally found a brooch he liked and entered Macy's in high spirits. To his surprise, everyone in the store seemed to reflect his mood. The doorman, a perennially harassed giant, beamed at him pleasantly. The elevator boys wore grins as big as his. Even the herd of customers who jammed the aisle seemed to be in a new and jovial mood as they poked each other and trotted on each other's toes. Fred's astonishment grew with each new proof of Chris's magic. Mrs. Walker was not in her office, and Chris was not in his dais, but in one corner of the toy department a large crowd had gathered. Fred found Doris in the crowd watching what was going on in silent awe, for there in a special setting in front of a Christmas tree stood Mr. Macy and Mr. Gimble actually shaking hands. They were posing for photographers with Chris beaming behind them. "This," said Doris, "is the miracle of miracles, a sight I never thought I'd live to see." "And it's all because of Mr. Kringle," Fred mused. Doris nodded silently and smiled at Fred. Bulbs flashed as Macy and Gimble faced the battery of cameras, smiling cordially as each pumped the other's hand. "Now we'll take one over at my store," said Mr. Gimble. And Mr. Macy eagerly agreed. Doris turned to Fred. "Pinch me, Fred," she said. "I simply don't believe it." Doris watched wide-eyed as the formalities proceeded. Now Mr. Macy was formally presenting Chris with a check, a bonus from the company, in appreciation of the wonderful new spirit which you have brought not only to Macy's but to the entire city as well. Mr. Kringle accepted it happily. Mr. Macy jokingly asked him what he intended to do with all of that money. Chris knew exactly what he would do. "I'm going to make this a particularly happy Christmas for someone who's been very kind to me," he said. "He's a doctor, and I'm going to give him an X-ray machine." "Well," Macy replied, "that's going to be quite expensive." "Let me handle it," said Mr. Gimble eagerly. "We'll get it for you wholesale." "We'll get it at cost," said Mr. Macy. Fred turned to Doris and took a little package from his pocket. "I have a little presentation to make myself," he said as he handed it to her, "but I thought I'd omit any formal ceremonies." Doris was touched and delighted by the brooch. She even allowed Fred to pin it on her. As they walked back toward her office, Doris slipped her arm through his. Right in front of the entire toy department, she was walking with him arm in arm. To Fred, this was even greater than the Macy Gimbel miracle. "It seems to me you're catching the Kringle spirit too," he said. Doris looked up at him and smiled. "I'm afraid I am," she replied. That was a fast chapter. Very short one. Sometimes they're long, sometimes they're short. It really depends on what's going on. So it was a little tiny chapter today, but I'll be back tomorrow. We're going to read chapter 10 tomorrow. So I'm going to go ahead and wish you a Merry, Merry Christmas. I'll see you back here tomorrow, and we will read chapter 10 of A Miracle on 34th Street.